everybody, and welcome to today's discussion addressing top issues facing the midstream industry, hosted by the Center for Midstream Management and Science at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. My name is Thomas Calvin. I am the director of the Midstream Center. This webinar is the first of 4 in the Midstream Center's 2024 series. All webinars are recorded and can be found on our website. Just go to lamar.edu/midstream, lamar.edu/midstream, and click on the News and Events tab. Today's program will be a 1-hour Q&A with our 3 panelists. We have on our panel Chris Jones, who is Global Director of LNG Pipelines and Terminals for Honeywell Process Solutions. He has been with Honeywell for 26 years. In his early days with Honeywell, Chris worked as an operator in chemical plants and then as an engineer, where he gained experience in various roles, including process engineering, production superintendent, and operations manager. More recently, Chris has lent his expertise in marketing, business development, estimating, and sales leadership. In his current role, Chris has a team of technical consultants and business leaders across the world that focus on the LNG and midstream industries to bring industry domain knowledge to their automation projects. Chris holds an MBA from Lamar University and a BS in chemical engineering. Our second panelist today is Juan Cardona. Juan is Senior Manager, System Planning and Asset Optimization at Summit Midstream Partners. He brings nearly 15 years of experience in the midstream and oil and gas industries. His primary focus is new applications, project development, and evaluation of new technologies. He holds an industrial engineering degree from Lamar University. Juan understands the importance of developing reliable oil and gas midstream infrastructure. Juan has managed several facility standardization efforts to enhance the viability of oil and gas midstream projects. During the past 3 years, Juan has worked on the optimization of pipeline systems and midstream facilities. And finally, our third panelist is Ajay Chandra. Ajay is Chief Executive Officer of Baker & O'Brien, Inc., an internationally known consulting firm. He has over 37 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, both in North America and internationally. Mr. Chandra joined Baker & O'Brien in 2022 after having gained experience in various facets of the midstream industry, including operations, engineering, business development, management, and consulting. Mr. Chandra has had a wide variety of assignments covering all aspects of the energy industry during his career and has had several long-term expatriate assignments, including Europe and Southeast Asia. Mr. Chandra's operating, consulting, and management experience includes working at Amoco, Purvitt & Gertz, Hess, NextEra Energy Resources, and Muse Stansel before joining Baker & O'Brien. For viewers, we are not taking live questions, and so make sure your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. If you have a question, please use the Zoom chat box, and if we have time, your question will be read and answered. Okay, let's get to our panelists. Chris, you're up first. You've pointed to commercial disruption as a major issue faced in our industry. Who are these midstream new entrants, and how do you see them impacting our industry?
Thanks, Thomas. So if we look at the midstream industry, one of the trends we've seen is just a flood of venture cap type firms, which are coming both into midstream as well as the LNG processing arena. So if we were to look at some of, mention LNG, probably the top of that list would be a company like Venture Global. That 5 years ago, no one knew who Venture Global was, and they've dominated the CapEx of that industry now. Maybe more in the traditional midstream area, we would see companies like Crestwood, Eagle Claw, companies like that which come up. And then maybe one dynamic that we've seen recently are the large majors who seem to be betting back in fossil fuels. And so we see some of the moderate-sized midstream companies getting scooped up, even some big ones. So Chevron buying Hess, ExxonMobil buying Denbury and buying Pioneer most recently. So we see new entrants, and then we're seeing this acquisition and bets by the traditionals buying them up.
Okay. What differences do you see in how these new entrants invest in projects compared to the traditional midstream players?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and if I were to maybe frame that with two words, I would say first, disruptive. It's been incredibly disruptive, not only from entrants, but the way they do business. And the second I would say is agility. So I'll go back to some of the earlier examples and use Venture Global, that they came in with a charter that they would build an LNG plant for approximately half of the capex that anyone else had built it. So, they disrupted, they went in and used what we traditionally called mid-scale licensing technologies. And rather than building one or two trains, they've built 36 trains within sites. So that's been the disruptive component, but also the agility, the speed to market, the reduction in capex, and the way they do business is, we'll say, incredibly different than the way it's been done by the oil majors.
Wow. Okay. Where do you see the differences in how they conduct business from an operational, maintenance, and commercial perspective?
I think that's the area that today we're looking at with an eye, and I'll talk in a couple areas. I'll continue on the example of Venture Global, just because we've talked about they're a new entrants. They've been incredibly disruptive with the way they invest capex and their agility, but also now they're in operational mode and they're different. So what I would say, again, probably the days of the handshake agreement are gone. Reading the fine print, it's a company ran by venture capitalists and lawyers. And you can, some of the recent Wall Street Journal articles we've seen in December, it's a company that signed long-term agreements with customers for offtake, but they're not fulfilling that. Instead, they're selling on the spot market at very, very high margins. So they disrupted the market. They took long-term contracts at very low margins. They disrupted commercial viability by some of the established players. For example, a Freeport LNG has put pause on a train 4 because they say the price to toll LNG, if it's Venture Global's price, it just doesn't look like a sustainable model for them. So the new player came in and dropped the price, yet until today, we're not seeing them honor those contracts. So it's, again, the day of the handshake agreement seems to be gone. I guess the other area in operational, though, is agility. There are no massive corporate engineering offices. There are no global engineering standards that are 1,000 pages thick. So that agility component is there. Outsourcing to suppliers for services rather than building in-house. Leveraging some of these types of operating models is different. And I would say in the world of midstream, we have classically managed the business with a hero and a white F-250 driving off to a site. And today we see the use of more technology to deploy remote operation, remote monitoring, technologies like that, where we're not using people on the road as much.
Okay, that's really interesting stuff. AJ, Juan, do you guys have any comments or thoughts on what Chris has talked about?
Well, I guess, Chris, I mean, you talk a little bit about, the older established companies. Chevron's getting into a lot of new businesses, and they're trying to be a disruptor. And I'm just picking Chevron kind of as one of them. How do you see them or companies like Chevron working with the new disruptors that you've talked about?
I think that's a good point, Ajay, and I think we just see this new wave of acquisitions. But maybe the best data point I'll take is with ExxonMobil when they acquired XTO ballpark 10 years ago, and they left XTO alone because they acquired them for their low-cost structure and their agility. And the philosophy, which was very non-ExxonMobil-esque, is that if we apply all of these global engineering standards, we will break XTO. We'll lose the cost advantage and the speed and all of that. So I do think the majors are open to learning lessons on this agility model. What I think the acquisition target is getting from a lot of this is what's become incredibly burdensome to the mid-size and small-size midstream companies, which goes to some topics we'll talk about later, and that's regulation around sustainability. Yeah. I think these smaller companies need help to
Yeah.
overcome the burden of the sustainability capex and investment that will be required with all the right reasons for ESG benefit, but very little return on the capital. And that's what the majors will bring, is that we'll say robustness from a cash flow.
Anything else, fellas, on this topic?
Yeah, I do have a question. How do you, Chris, how do you, have you noticed the difference between the new disruptors and the legacy bigger companies in how they approach ESG, specifically in the environmental portion, emissions? How much does one care more than the other?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I would say the majors, the Chevrons and the Exxons that we've referred to, they've got their published net zero commitment. So I would say prior to regulation, they've already kicked off the initiatives. But with recent changes in December 2023 from the EPA, I think all of us are forced to care about that. So we've got some early adopters with those majors. Those newer entrants and companies that have a lot of agility will be some of the ones that are forced to reckon with it. But also I see some of them as having the solution to the problem. So some of these newer entrants are having liquefaction technologies closer to the well site, mid-scale, small-scale liquefaction, where we have stranded gas. Maybe another company I'll look at, one of the major pipelines to get stranded gas out of the Permian, we see the project listed with Permico. I mean, none of us have dealt with Permico as a company before, and they've been in and out of financial viability for a few years. But I think it's going to be some of those disruptors that will make the bet with regulation now and get some of these projects over the capex hurdle too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's just really interesting stuff. Okay, AJ, you're in the batter's box. Your chosen topic is economics. You've pointed out that most people do not really understand how they will be personally impacted by the many new policies and regulations flowing out of Washington. On the energy production side, how does the cost of renewables compare with fossil fuels?
Yeah, so that's I mean, it's a very, very broad topic, and it's always interesting because everybody, if you're driving a car where you have to put gasoline into it, if you have an internal combustion engine, you're driving by a gas station, 30 gas stations from the time you leave your house to the time you get to work, and you always see the price of that. The problem with renewables, you don't see the price of that in your face all the time. So everybody complains, gasoline goes from $2.50 to $3 a gallon or whatever the numbers are, because you're constantly seeing that. But just think right now, we're in a world of $70 to $75 a barrel crude oil. The all-in cost of renewables is probably closer to about $200 a barrel equivalent when you look at the energy, because there's a lot of capex and there's a lot of infrastructure. And that's one thing that our industry, being fossil fuels, has always been very, very good at, is we built a lot of infrastructure over time. Again, I talk about the gasoline stations. I can drive anywhere, and within a few blocks, I've hit a gasoline station. Well, if we want to use electric vehicles, if you don't want to put a charger at your house, we're going to have to build a whole infrastructure that goes along with that. And I think those are some of the hidden costs that people don't realize. And when you start talking about what the real costs are associated with that, my friends that got Teslas early on, they're like, oh, this is great, I don't have to pay for gasoline. But electricity is not free. It's just that it's hidden in your monthly electric bill. And so you probably didn't realize the amount of electricity that you're putting into it. Or you're going someplace and there were free chargers for some period of time, and you weren't swiping your credit card every time you wanted to charge up your car. So now some of those things are coming out, is that you're going to go someplace and there's not a free charger anymore. You got to pay for it. Or you got to put a larger the system at your house has to be upgraded, and all of a sudden you're a few $1,000s if you want to buy that. And then there's the additional hidden costs of things like the batteries, or the fact that 7 to 8 to 9 years you're going to replace the batteries in these vehicles. So that's just one part of it. In Europe, we're seeing some very interesting things on the economic side because they all wanted to go to renewables. We had, places like Germany, they shut down all their nuclear plants, and they were, using natural gas. And then we have the Russia-Ukraine war, and all of a sudden you can't get gas from Russia anymore into, Western Europe. So guess what? The Germans are now looking around, and they imported a lot of LNG last winter, which was good for them, but it was a little bit more expensive than they planned on. And now they're looking at coal and nuclear and all the other things that were shut down for some period of time. Some of those are going to come back up. Again, I kind of mentioned a $70 to $75 a barrel, for crude oil. Coal is at about a $50 per barrel equivalent on a BTU basis. So there's a lot of places around the world where all of a sudden they're going, I can pay $75 for a fossil fuel, or I can pay $50 for coal. Not counting the pollution aspects of coal. I'm not suggesting that we go build a bunch of coal plants or something, but it's just to give you some comparisons in terms of the economics associated with some of these.
Wow. This discussion is pretty amazing. Well, how about this? On the energy consumption side, how will regulatory imposition of things like EVs and other consumer products impact everyone's pocketbook?
Well, I mean, there's two pieces to that. Is one, I think a lot of people have had uptakes of EVs, and I think that's great. I think we need that to occur. What's actually surprised me a few years ago, I probably would have expected hybrids to take off a lot better. And there's been, again, numbers, and you can look at the economics that show that, hybrids probably are a pretty good alternative. And maybe they're the bridge to get us to the point to where we have enough infrastructure for EVs. But so much of what we're doing has been driven by the regulatory pieces, right? I mean, renewables, solar, wind, there's been all these great tax credits for large-scale utility generation of electricity with renewable and solar. But if you take away those tax credits, it doesn't necessarily make economic sense. And so, basically we've got, for all of us as taxpayers, we're funding this transition to the EV market or electrical market or the renewables going into the future. But we're already seeing some blips in that. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we had this big cold front across the country. Those of us here in Texas, it got pretty cold, and you saw pictures in the paper of electric vehicles up in Chicago that couldn't charge their batteries because it was too cold to charge the batteries. So again, it's a combination of the technology and the regulatory issues, and I think we've got to find a way to solve them that makes sense and makes economic sense. And I guess I'll take a little bit of a pot shot at politicians because they don't have to worry about the economics of what they implement.
Okay. How about the little tangent here? Do you have any thoughts on the economic impact of regulations promoting carbon sequestration and hydrogen as a fuel?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think generally, and we'll talk to the other panelists, but I think our industry is generally for diversifying all the sources of electricity. And I start that as the thought that the world economy is growing, and we've still got a lot of countries that haven't fully developed. And so energy usage generally is going up. And we've got fossil fuels, we've got, of course, all these other alternatives, and we need all of those in order to meet the demand. Now, you specifically asked about some things like hydrogen. Again, I'm going to go back to kind of my gasoline station analogy because infrastructure is the key to that. It'd be great to have hydrogen vehicles. It'd be great to have hydrogen fuel cells, but we don't have the distribution system for it. I mean, that's one part of the problem. So there's a huge amount of capital that would be required for that distribution. But then we also don't have the means of production in the way that everybody wants to snap their fingers and get it going. For example, in hydrogen, a great way to do that is to obviously take seawater or water and break out the hydrogen, very clean way of making that. But we don't have what I would call world scale electrolyzers to be able to produce that hydrogen. Most of the hydrogen that's produced now is produced from taking natural gas and using steam methane reforming in order to be able to get that hydrogen out. Well, some people, some of the environmentalists are saying, no, I don't want to use natural gas to get the hydrogen. We want to use the water to get the hydrogen. So, it's kind of a hard debate to have, but that's part of it. The production is part of it. And then, of course, we've also got to be able to distribute it. And we've got some of the same issues on carbon sequestration. The government or government regulatory bodies want to promote that, and I think that's fantastic. But they're giving a tax credit that's artificially creating economics for things that otherwise wouldn't be there. If you take a power plant, a regular fossil fuel burning power plant, for a while, there was a look at putting scrubbers and capturing that CO2 and sequestering it. Fantastic. We can use amine systems that we've been using for 100 years in gas processing and refining to be able to capture that. But then all of a sudden, we're looking at $75 a million cubic feet or something along those kinds of numbers to be able to have the amine systems and the sequestration systems to capture that CO2. We pump it to the ground, and I think under the new tax regulations, there's a $3 to $4 credit for sequestering it. But again, all of these are relatively artificial constraints put on the system. And right now, there's a whole bunch of people that want to go out there and do projects, but they're not doing the projects because the project makes sense. They're doing the project because they're capturing the tax value.
Yeah. And any thoughts from Chris or Juan on this topic? It's quite broad.
So I think there's maybe one area I'd like to bounce off of, Ajay, and that is, we talk about tax credits. We talk about the difference between fossil fuels and renewables. And if I think in parallel, if we go back 30 years ago where we had these ozone depleting refrigerants, right? We used to use Freon 12 in our cars, and today we use 134. And the way the government addressed that is they taxed the old one out of existence. They never banned making it or using it, but all of a sudden it became $800 a pound, where the new one was $7 or $10 a pound. So what do you think in this world of taxation that we just tax fossil fuels until they're equal with renewables?
Yeah, I mean, that would be one way to drive, again, equality in that. And, the Europeans started looking at some things like that. I mean, carbon taxes or emissions taxes, however you want to look at it in that particular way. I would say that our industry and other industries, we've got a lot of really smart people. You give them the rules of play, and they will figure out the best thing to do within that set of rules. The difficulty we have is when you change the rules halfway through the game, right? And that has happened to us a number of times. If the governments or regulatory bodies would say, this is the way we want to set it up, and Chris, you've got a great idea of just, again, an equal playing field, we'll figure out the best way to do that. We'll figure out the best ways to optimize that for everybody involved. We just got to figure out, I mean, I'll go back to kind of the Tesla, right? I mean, Tesla's dropped their prices on their cars a couple of times, and now you've got a new tax credit associated with EVs. I'm not even sure I understand how all that fits in, about whether it makes sense to buy one and, you get the tax credit or you don't get the tax credit, or does the dealer get the tax credit? That's way beyond my area of expertise.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned carbon tax, and that's something we see probably in the not so distant future pointed towards industry. But the thought is it's going to trickle down. Yeah. It's going to go to the consumer. And especially in the maritime industry, there are huge concerns with the level of tax, carbon taxes, and if consumers are willing to pay that for cargo or for cruise ship excursions or these sorts of things. I think at some point it seems very nice to think about a carbon tax at a macro level, but once it's going to push down to that consumer level where every one of us feels that, and we got to test the tolerance of that.
And that's exactly right. I mean, everybody again will optimize on whatever their particular situation is. Again, as long as the rules stay relatively constant.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Um,
On EVs, there's another item that often doesn't come up in the everyday narrative, and it's how carbon intensive are they really, right? Nobody talks about that. Everybody talks about the immediate emissions created by the vehicle. Nobody talks about the overall carbon footprint of the vehicle.
okay.
And I was just looking some facts this morning, and listen to these numbers. They're pretty crazy. It takes 25,000 pounds of brine that you need to process to get the lithium for one battery. 30,000 pounds of ore to get the cobalt for one battery. 5,000 pounds of ore to get the nickel. 25,000 pounds of ore to get copper. Adds up to approximately 500,000 pounds of earth crust that has to be processed in some way to make one battery. So imagine the machinery that it takes to move that mass and to process it, right? So some of the estimates tell us an EV doesn't really become carbon equivalent to a traditional combustion engine until it reaches, some say 65,000, some say up to 120,000 miles, right? And by then, you are that much closer, probably a couple years, if not already there, from having to replace that battery. So that means that your carbon footprint is going to spike immediately as soon as you replace that battery. So I don't know that today we have the right tools and technology to say that EVs have a better carbon footprint than a gas combustion engine. And I think that's something that never comes up in the narrative, right? Then to AJ's point earlier of is it cheaper to have an EV? Maybe it was at one point, right? But electricity keeps going up, partly because electricity goes up with natural gas prices, right? And fossil fuels, it tends to go hand in hand. And then secondly, because the government is now taxing EV owners because they don't pay a gas tax, right? When we go to the pump and we fill up, a little bit of that portion of the price per gallon is a tax, right? Which the government's not getting from EV owners. So now they're getting taxed $600 a year for driving an EV, which translates to about, let's call it $45 a month. That's a full tank of gas for an SUV. And so nobody's talking about the numbers, right? And like you guys were saying earlier, the economics never show up in the narrative, right? We talk only about the big emissions picture, and we don't talk about the overall impact of these technologies, right? And then finally on hydrogen, I think we would all love to make hydrogen work. It's honestly the cleanest source of energy that we can get. But today, at a large scale, it actually takes more energy to make hydrogen than that same hydrogen will produce. So, for example, if you want to make 3 megawatts worth of energy from hydrogen, you have to spend 5 megawatts to make that hydrogen. So these are all things that we have to be realistic about, and most importantly, the everyday person needs to be educated on these matters, right? Because at the end of the day, really what it impacts is their wallet, right? Their bank account. All these things add up to cost, right? The only way to make these technologies and these sources of energy work is if you tax the other cheaper energy sources, right?
Well, and there's also the part about preferences from the consumer, because like Ford found out, they said, oh, we're going to go to an all electric fleet in, I don't know, 5-10 years, whatever. But guess what? Their sales of EVs have not met their expectations, and so now they're retooling some of their plants to basically produce more ICE engines than electric vehicles.
That,
You know, I guess, I mean, the F-150 Lightning or whatever they call it was supposed to, you know, probably a pretty cool vehicle. Performance is fantastic, but I don't think, I think they've actually scaled back their production line on building those cars, trucks.
discontinued. I believe they're not making them at all. And
Oh,
then,
okay.
yeah, I actually read a headline this morning. I haven't read through the whole article, but I read a headline saying that Volkswagen was letting their investors know that they were canceling a funding round that they were running for developing EVs, and they're canceling it because there's no demand, right?
Yeah.
And so if there's no infrastructure to power those EVs, like you mentioned earlier, people have to put chargers at their homes. That's expensive. Chargers in the street get full really fast. It takes a long time to charge them. So if the infrastructure is not there, the adoption is not going to be there either, right? You can't pin people into adopting something that is going to make their life harder, right? Life goes fast enough as it is already, and people need simpler. And right now, the simplest, I don't know at what point we switched from making vehicles and production as efficient as possible to, okay, that doesn't work at all. Everybody needs to go to EV because that's horrible. And so hybrids were a brilliant idea. It was a brilliant way to transition into it. They're incredibly energy efficient, right? And nobody's talking about hybrids. Everything
Yeah,
seems
I mean, a lot of the hybrids get 60, 70 mile equivalents
right.
per gallon, you know, and so again,
Right.
you can do it. Yeah, but you can't even buy, there's very few hybrids you can buy that, you know, again, are even on the market. You either go to an ICE or you go to an all electric and kind of nothing in between, which.
Yeah.
So
And then
the hybrids.
One more little thing on this one. Also something that never shows up. And it's that I realized this a couple weeks ago having a conversation with my brother. We're trying to come up with these crazy ideas of how to make things more efficient. And he said something so basic, right, that we learned probably freshman year of college or earlier, is energy cannot be created nor destroyed, right? But it can be wasted. So if you think of all these versions of clean energy, how much energy are we wasting to get there, right? So if you think of an engine that runs on natural gas, for example, that engine is taking the molecule of energy and directly applying it to creating whatever it's doing, right? Either running a compressor, running a generator, whatever it is, it's directly applying it to them, right? When you go to EVs, you have to go, and electrifying in general, you have to look at how are we making that energy, right? The most efficient generator out there is roughly 85% efficient, which means that it wastes 15% of that energy in the form of heat or something else, right? And then normal generators are maybe in the mid 50s of efficiency, which means that we're wasting half of the energy versus an engine that's using that molecule directly to exert the force.
You know, it seems to me that one word has become the most important word in the English language in the last couple of years, and that word is narrative. It's like narrative. I don't remember using that word for the first, you know, like my first 60 years. It just wasn't something that popped up. Now it's in every sentence. And like you mentioned, AJ, you know, the hybrid. Hybrid to me seems like a great idea. At worst, it's a stepping stone, but it's a great idea for efficiency. But it doesn't meet the narrative of, you know, because it uses hydrocarbon for fuel. At the end of the day, it's not good. It's like natural gases enable the United States to dramatically reduce emissions, but it is still inadequate because of the narrative for clean energy. I think narrative that word has become the single most important word in the English language in recent years. And I think it's just sort of, it's amusing and painful at the same time. That was a great discussion, fellas. Juan, Okay, you're in the batter's box. You have essentially said that a dog's breakfast of new regulations, government energy policy, and permitting conflicts are real issues facing the midstream industry. I like the word dog's breakfast, it's apt. What kind of issues do you run into when you're permitting new midstream infrastructure?
So I think when it comes down to regulation itself and the way it is enforced in different regions, the biggest challenge is how inconsistent it is, right? And so AJ mentioned earlier how the rules of the game have changed several times. And I mean, I think several times is a little bit of an understatement because I feel like they change every other year, right? It seems like, and they change at different rates in different regions, right? Depending on what state you operate in, they might change faster or slower, or the changes might be more dramatic. But I think that's the challenge with regulation and new regulation is we can't really. It's hard to even keep up with the changes because they happen so often and they are so inconsistent, right? And not only that, some of these changes are somewhat unrealistic, right? Especially when you're talking about older infrastructure, remote infrastructure, some of the new requirements are making it to where operating some of these legacy facilities that were built, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years ago is becoming uneconomic, right? So you're gonna find a lot of producers having to shut in facilities and cut production because their infrastructure cannot comply with the new regulation. And so I think there needs to be a balance on how we do this. And maybe the right answer to that is making the timeframes to comply more realistic, right? You can't retrofit an entire facility in the middle of nowhere in 6 months or a year, right? Maybe we want to do it, right? And also from a capital perspective, if you operate a dozen of these facilities and you have a year to retrofit all of them, you're going to spend all your capital dollars doing that. And so then there's no growth in the other areas. So all of this leads to less supply of hydrocarbons, higher prices at the pump. And then at the end, again, we go back to what we were saying earlier, the ones that are impacted the most is the end user, the end consumer, the everyday person driving their car to and from work.
Okay.
And it also, by the way, drives inflation and food and all kinds of other things, right? It affects everything.
Yeah. Energy is one of the largest elements of cost in our society. And it's low cost energy is, I think, a huge part of the success of the American economy and a source of our standard of living. And a lot of people don't seem to realize that when they want to penalize various energy sources.
That's right.
Okay, how about this? Does it vary state by state or even by county, these issues on permitting?
Big time. I mean, there are some states that are very friendly to oil and gas. There are states that seem to understand how it all meshes together, right? For example, gas is something that comes out of a lot, if not most of the wells, right? And gas is the number one source of emissions, especially methane. That's probably the worst gas that we can emit directly to the atmosphere. And so you need to have takeaway solutions for that gas in order to get to the crude, right? And so there are states who understand that. So they understand that the permitting process for midstream gas infrastructure is just as important as permitting, as awarding new drilling permits, right? Without one, you can't have the other. However, there are other states that don't seem to understand how that works together. And so you have permitting process for example, a compressor, which is an engine that has emissions, that can last up to 18 months. And they permit the wells in sometimes as little as 6 months, right? But that permit does nothing if you don't have if the midstreamer doesn't have a permit for the compressor to move that gas. So it all gets stranded in this very convoluted permitting process. And there seems to be a lot of focus in how many wells are permitted, how many available permits for development are out there, and nobody looks at how many midstream infrastructure projects are being permitted, right? Permitting a transmission line today is one of the most complex permit process that are out there, right? It takes a long time. You have to deal with a lot of landowners, and which, by the way, has become increasingly difficult lately. And it's part of, I'm going to use the word again, it's part of the narrative, right? I mean, we encounter landowners out there that they don't even want to talk to us. They just don't want to see us. And so in a way, it kind of pushes us into the only option, which is condemnation, which is a tense process that ends up causing more friction, right? The project has to happen. It's going to happen. So you can negotiate with the landowners, but if they don't want to talk to you, you have to go through condemnation, right? And these type of processes, they seem to create more tension. And we should be working to create less tension, right? We should be working to educate people to understand how important these projects are, right? I mean, every now and then we cross paths with professional landowners, and that's a completely different story, right? Because they'll sit down and talk to you and negotiate, and they're expensive, but they know that the project has to go through, which is very different to meeting a landowner who's just a private piece of land, and they don't even want to talk to you, and you're the only way across. And they want to talk to you legitimately because they don't like you, and they don't even know why we're doing what we're doing, right? So it's hard, right? And look, not trying to play the victim, because we'll work around all those things, and we'll continue to do so. But it's just not a healthy environment to operate in, right? For either side. I think that's the biggest challenge there.
How about different agencies? Not only are there a lot of different legal entities, counties, states, but also a bunch of different agencies. How do different agencies enforce regulations? Is it the same cast of characters who behave differently, or are they kind of unique?
So very similar to what we just discussed on counties and states. It really depends where you're at and who enforces the rules. Every state has a different entity that enforces somewhat similar rules. Maybe that's an area for improvement at the government level. I'm not saying that there should be a central agency to permit everything, because I think it's a healthy balance to have the states own that responsibility, right? But maybe there's some guidelines for on how the state should enforce and could enforce these. But even more surprising, Tom, is even within an agency, we have encountered discrepancies on how one individual will enforce the same rule, right? So same agency, just different person, and we get different answers. Yeah. That's the biggest challenge right now. It's so inconsistent that it's hard to navigate. It's very hard to navigate. I'm going to give you an example of a really interesting project that begun maybe 2-3 years ago, and it's supposed to be the largest CO2 capture project in the country by a landslide, a lot. This is a big project with over $1 billion funding in the bank, ready to spend the money to create jobs, to capture carbon. So essentially exactly what the administration wants to do. And guess what? It fell through because of permitting issues. And this is right from Reuters. I was reading it this morning. They cancel it due to unpredictable state regulatory process. I mean, that's crazy, right? If you think about it, who can understand that? It's the one thing that the government is pushing, which is carbon capture, and they can't even get that past the regulatory process. It's just backwards.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Dog's breakfast. How does the current media and politics narrative, we're back to the word narrative, can't escape it these days, play into developing new new midstream infrastructure before you even get to permitting and whatnot?
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Okay. How does the current media or political narrative play into developing new midstream infrastructure?
Oh, it plays a huge role. I mean, most of what we're seeing right now as the main issues, right? And and those who follow the Lamar Center for Midstream Management, every year we put out the top 10 issues facing midstream. We all talk about it and we all spit ideas. And we seem the last 3 years, we seem to land on the same three issues, right? Retaining talent, new regulation, how to capture capital, right? And all those things seem to be, somewhat driven by the narrative, right? Especially that how to capture and retain talent one is a big one that comes up every year on our list. And I mean, if you have a bunch of college students that think that midstream and oil and gas is evil, they're not going to want to go work there, right? Why would they?
Right.
If I was in their shoes when I graduated, I would have thought about it 10 times before going into oil and gas, right? If I legitimately believed that I was going to an industry that harms the planet and damages people, I would have tried to do something else, right? So I think that's where it hurts the most, is in the ability to attract new talent. That narrative that we see in the news and in social media, I think that's where it hurts the most, right? The landowner issue, we navigate that, but new talent is one that hurts a lot. It's difficult to get younger adults interested in this industry.
Yeah, I note that in this year's top 10 survey, human capital issues, retaining talent, and the political environment were the top two issues. And the scoring was very, very close. I mean, it was very, very close. And I found it disturbing that the political element displaced what I'll call general operating concerns and issues by what concerns people. And it's sort of disturbing. It's disturbing to me. And to me, it points to a thought that was I mentioned in the top 10 survey write-up, was that perhaps it's time for the midstream industry to engage with society and students in a positive educational process, to teach people, so people grow up that, actually the midstream industry is very clean, doesn't kill puppies. It's high technology. It'll be around long after we're all gone, and it's a great career choice. I promote those ideas because I believe them to be true, and I wonder if it's time for the industry to begin to engage with society, and particularly through students and universities and whatnot, to teach them or enable them. One of the things that the Midstream Center does is we have an annual essay contest, and it's for all disciplines. And right now it's open to all four-year Texas public universities. And the objective is to get kids from all walks of life, whether it could be a nursing student, or it could be a lawyer, it could be an engineer, it could be anything. And there's a cash prize, and the objective is to get people to take a look, to write an essay on some aspect of midstream industry. The current contest is out there. It's about aging infrastructure is the topic. But what it'll do is it just inadvertently teaches students about what the industry is and what its issues are. You have to do that to write the essay to win the prize. And it's just it's a mechanism, and it draws attention to an industry that we can't live without. We need, and a lot of people don't seem to know that. Anyway, in recent years, this is a very broad question. In recent years, new regulation has impacted the industry. How has, if you look back over the last 5-10 years, how has the midstream industry been impacted? The industry has had to like shift courses, change directions, behave differently. What do you have to say to this very open-ended question?
I mean, it's been impacted in so many different ways. I think we've touched on a lot of them.
Yeah.
But I also want to say something positive. Out of this whole process that we've gone through the past, 5 to 8 years, one thing I must say is that the industry has become a lot more efficient, right? Mm-hmm. Companies run leaner, facilities are more productive. And I'm not, this applies to both midstreamers and producers, right? The wells are producing more with the same capital. The midstreamers are moving more with less emissions, right? So we all seem to be improving at what is, in my opinion, a very accelerated pace, right? So there is some positive to all this. We need to let everybody know that is actually happening, right? Yeah, I think it's been affected in many ways, both negative and positive, right? I think it has stifled growth in many areas, but in other parts, it has made it more efficient, both from an operating perspective and from a capital dollars perspective. So I think there's both good and bad to this.
Yeah, I agree. I think back, my career in the energy, oil and gas industry started about 45 years ago. I was a young engineer, and the things that companies focus on, the things they do, are vastly improved. A lot of it's due to technology or new social and societal awareness. And again, they say that it's not your grandfather's Pontiac, or however that saying goes, but it is a modern industry today. And then a lot of these pressures have caused everybody to operate better and more thoughtfully. Very true. Chris, AJ, do you have any comments on this area?
Maybe just one short comment, and that's to add to what Juan mentioned is, well, unfortunately, we can't put state and county boundary lines in the air. So we're breathing one air, around the globe. And I think especially in North America, we have some of the most efficient operations in the world. So some balance of driving regulation, yet keeping the industry where we're doing things in a sustainable and efficient manner is important, because at some point, the burden and cost, if it becomes too onerous, just drives it to a different part of the world where those regulations are not as strict.
Yeah.
I mean, my comment again on the regulatory front, we've got to make sure that they're reasonable regulations, and again, they're consistent regulations. We'll find ways to get around that. And of course, again, from a governmental standpoint, from the politician standpoint, we do have to change people's behaviors, and you do that through the regulatory process or through the mandating certain things. So it's not necessarily bad that we go to EVs or have more renewables, but we just have to be balanced in the way that we look at all that stuff and how it's enacted.
That's right.
That's outstanding. Gentlemen, this has been outstanding. We have one question that's a very good one that I want to throw out to you in the last few minutes here. The question is, where do you see the role of AI in the midstream industry? That's very topical. And so I throw that to the panel. Who wants to take a jab at that one? You know, I know Honeywell's gotta love AI.
Well, I'll jump in. So we'll say, it depends. It's a balance, right? The age-old answer. AI is incredibly promising, and frankly, from a technology perspective, we're betting and placing big bets on it. But I will also say AI without traditional intelligence is a dangerous tool as well. And I've seen teams, and I won't claim that they were our teams, come in with amazing insights that, the load on your cooling system is going up when the ambient temperature outside rises. Yeah. And the challenge is it was a perfect correlation to a data scientist who had no context of what they were analyzing. And so when we talk about talent availability and experience, we still have to see when the data correlates, is that a meaningful insight to us or not? Yeah. We do have some tough problems in the industry. And, I think of one back up to our northern friends some years ago with SAG-D and when to inject steam and things like that. And when do you need to inject steam? How long should you inject steam? What's the optimum? How do you optimize? That really gets to be an exercise that's beyond at least what my microprocessor can handle. And as you start getting massive data sets, being able to use more complex statistical engines and AI will solve some of those industry problems that we've just ran out of processing power to do with traditional means. So it's a balance. We need that insight and experience to make sure it's meaningful, but the new technologies and new insights are incredibly promising.
That's good. Thank you, sir. We have about 2 minutes left. Anybody want to add anything else on this topic or any other topic?
Yeah, I think specifically to midstream industry, I think where I see some room for AI in the near term is probably something related to predictive maintenance. It's not my area of expertise, but I think that's where we could see an entry into the industry. Maintenance and uptime is one of the most important things for us. And every time something breaks and there's anything we could have done to prevent that, we should be looking into it. So I think that's an area where we might see some improvements yield from AI.
Yeah, I got a lot of final comment on that point is that here at Lamar, we're actually, Midstream Centers funded a number of projects looking at deep learning and AI for maintenance and preventive maintenance, developing the algorithms. And we have a project, as a matter of fact, with a company where essentially Midstream funded this thing for like 2.5 years. And then a company stepped in and said, hey, we got these big pumps and these compressors. And, we're trying to gather data. We want to do it. We want to develop this preventive maintenance system. The information's there. We just got to wrap our arms around it. The problem is with this kind of thing is that everybody has a day job, and this is something new. And it takes commitment from a company to get involved in it, develop the data, and then, again, here at Lamar, we have the people that are working on this topic and have been for a couple of years. So it's very topical. Okay, that sort of takes us to the end of our hour, gentlemen. Juan, AJ, Chris, we are out of time. The Midstream Center for Management and Science, Lamar University, thanks you for your participation today. To our viewers, we greatly appreciate your attention, and we hope that this discussion delivered value to you. Be on the lookout for an invitation to our next webinar in the Midstream Center's 2024 series. As a little foreshadow, it's on April 2nd, And the topic will be political impact on the midstream industry. Be well, everybody, and look for that invitation. Thank you very much.